ESPN Radio, 1300, 92.5. It's the bottom line with Brad Taylor. Thank you so much for joining us on this blessed Sunday morning. 859-381-1313 if you want to join in on the conversation this morning. I know of some people who have told me that they listen on their way to church on Sunday mornings. Mr. Ronnie, AC, may God bless you in your words today. And blessings to all of us here on this Sunday morning. You can follow us on Twitter at BottomLineLex. And you can email the show anytime. We have an email address, bottomlinelex@gmail.com. Thanks for joining the fastest growing sports talk show in Lexington. On today's show, Kentucky basketball off to a good start with 2 games in the next 60 hours, including one game which will be a measuring stick against the number 1 team in America. The Bengals have an entirely different look today when they take the field against the Giants, a game you can hear on our sister station, 92.1 Classic Rock at 1 o'clock. And, of course, as always, the most profitable segment in Lexington radio, our Mac Daddy Stogie Picks, coming off yet another profitable week last week. In fact, it was an undefeated week against point spread. All that and much, much more here on today's edition of The Bottom Line with Brad Taylor. But first, the blame game. In today's society, we all need to blame something or someone for everything that's wrong in the world. It's the cancel culture. You mess up, and the social media comes down on you until some sort of action is taken against you. So who do we blame for Kentucky football's 3-6 disaster this season after yesterday's 34-10 loss to Florida down in Gainesville? Well, our good friend John Clay's headline in the Lexington Herald-Leader says, thankfully, this football season will be over soon. Well, I always hate to agree with John Clay because it goes against everything I believe in. But this time, for once, he's right. After yesterday's loss, 34-10, of course, the investors out there had to do a little sweat at the end. That line was 24.5, 25. I know some people who got it at 24. They had to sweat that last little play at the end when the Gators were still trying to score at the end of the game. That's neither here nor there. Oh, that's when we say only the gamblers and the families pay attention to the end of those games. That was Exhibit A yesterday, ladies and gentlemen. But Mark Stoops now 4-5 against the spread after yesterday's cover, but he's 6-3 to the under. We've been preaching he is a great under coach, under the total in SEC games. Flew under that total by 17 yesterday. The last 2 weeks, though, Kentucky has lost by a combined score of 99-13. To say yesterday's game was disappointing was an understatement. Of course it was. You don't want to lose that game by that score, especially coming off that Alabama disaster. But Florida isn't nearly as good as Alabama, and the numbers show that. But once again, Kentucky played well early on against Florida, just like they did last week against Alabama for 20 minutes. But once again, mistakes, silly play calls, they all cost Kentucky. And the game ended basically at the end of the first half when Florida pulled off that little kick foolery and everybody went to one side and the punt return went to the other side. By the way, the Gators did a lot of kind of trick plays and kind of stuff they pulled out of their back pockets. For a team, when you're Goliath, why do you want to play like you're David and pull out these trick plays against Kentucky? You'll have to ask Dan Mullen that. But on the first drive of the game, Kentucky went all the way down to the red zone. They got to get a touchdown on the first drive of the game, but they got sacked twice in 3 plays. Now you don't even get a field goal. And, of course, Florida goes right down the field and wins ahead 7-0. Then Kentucky comes up with another good drive. Now they tie the game. But the thing that really caught my eye in that one is when Eddie Grand called a timeout right before that touchdown, and Mark Stoops and Vince Merrill, both in his face, yelling as they go to commercial on ESPN. What were they yelling at him for? Was he going to try some kind of quarterback sneak like he usually does on 3rd and goal? What was going to happen? Well, Stoops and Merrill were not going to have that. They came out. Terry Wilson got a touchdown pass. But the second half of that game, once that punt return happened, the second half was just terrible. That third quarter, yet again, the Achilles heel for this team. After Terry Wilson's second interception, just like last week, he was yanked. Kentucky had the first drive of the game, they went 5 plays, 75 yards. In the second half, 21 plays, 41 yards. And, of course, they helped Kyle Trask in his Heisman Trophy campaign. He's the odds-on favorite to win now, if you can believe that. And, of course, his tight end, Kyle Pitts, looks like the next Shannon Sharp, especially when he plays against Kentucky. So, yes, the last 2 weeks against Bama and Florida, they were bad. But there's been some worse games this year. That Missouri game was really bad. Letting Vandy hang around, that was kind of bad. And now South Carolina comes to town, a team that appears to have mailed it in weeks ago and finally got their coach fired that we had been calling for since August on this show. So do you really think there's going to be a buzz for that game or here in Lexington? Are you desperately looking for tickets to get into senior day for this team next Saturday? I'm not either. Next Saturday is a game for the families, the gamblers, and the school to cash a paycheck. Nothing more. Then again, that's what most teams are doing this year anyway, especially in the SEC. But who is to blame? I need to know who is to blame for this season. Is the blame on Mark Stoops? After so many seasons here at Kentucky, this team still makes the mistakes that other schools in the SEC don't seem to make, especially the teams like Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and the likes. Teams like Alabama, they don't make mistakes like this, like Kentucky's made just in the last 2 seasons alone. The recruiting is what makes Mark Stoops very valuable to Kentucky, not his game day genius, using that term very loosely. Stoops called a timeout yesterday after a third down play when the Gators were about to punt so that Kentucky could get the ball back with less than a minute to go deep in their own territory. Now, do you really think at that time that Kentucky was going to try to air it out and go down the field, asking Terry Wilson to do what he's never been able to do in his entire career, 2-minute offense? In that situation, just get to the locker room. What are you calling a timeout for? Just so you could kneel down? Get to the locker. If I learned anything playing Tecmo Bowl against people who were 100 times better than me at Tecmo Bowl decades ago, get to the locker room at the end of the first half when you're the inferior team. Special teams errors. Stoops says he doesn't need a special teams coach. It's been a long time since you had those kickers, McGinnis, and of course your punter now, Max Duffy. Yeah, but a special teams coach would help all those other mistakes. This team never gets return yardage, and they have plenty of errors on special teams. But Stoops has taken a step back this year, and the recruiting can only save him so far because all I've heard for weeks is about those mythical, magical 4 wide receivers that are being recruited that are going to be the next Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and Terrell Owens, all rolled into these 4 guys. Well, one of those 4 just flipped, and now he went from committing to Kentucky to Cincinnati. So now you're down to 3. Even if Cincinnati is undefeated this year, Cincinnati should not be getting players that Kentucky wants. Is the blame on Eddie Gran? We saw that episode yesterday where he was getting yelled at by Mark Stoops and Vince Marimo vehemently as they faded to black going to commercial when they called a timeout. Even with the masks on, which sadly for us, we couldn't read the lips, but you didn't think that those guys were asking each other about what they had for Thanksgiving dinner. After the timeout, after the yelling, Terry Wilson threw a touchdown pass, so I guess the yelling worked. But this team has been outscored by 70 points this year, but they're even in the first half. In the first half of these games, they're competing. But they're down 45 points total in these games in the third quarter and 25 in the fourth quarter. I always cringe when I hear fans rant about how their coaches don't make adjustments at halftime like everybody's a coach. But even Nick Saban this week said how Gran had called a successful play in the first half of their game last week against Alabama. Then at halftime, Saban made an adjustment, and when Gran called that same play in the second half, Alabama returned it for a pick 6. Gran does not do things at halftime to adjust, and the numbers say so. But he has been good at Kentucky. Of course, we all remember 2018. The 2019 season was a miracle with a wide receiver playing quarterback all year. What they did with Steven Johnson a few years back, who might be the most important player that Mark Stoops ever had for what he did for that program. But 2020 has been terrible. And this offensive line, who's going to have players in the NFL, multiple players on this offensive line, they're all going to be in the NFL next year. And they're all leaving after this season. They're seeming to be wasted with this offense right now. And whenever there's a big play coming, The play call is usually a quarterback keeper or sneak of some sort. Players for the second consecutive week yesterday were talking about the offensive coordinator's play calling and critiquing them on Twitter. And like we said last time, you don't see players from Alabama, Clemson, or Ohio State get on the play callers. Depending on what happens in the next two games, I don't see Eddie Gran back here next year. Will he be here next year? Should he be here next year? I know the fans really don't want it, but it's just too tough to ignore what's happened this season. Is the blame on the COVID virus? The COVID took away the 3 annual cupcake victories and added SEC teams in place of those cupcakes this year, making them 3-6 is what they need to do in those games when they usually have those cupcakes. But keep in mind that Kentucky has had only one winning season in the SEC since 1977. Just let that resonate for a minute. One winning season in the conference in 43 years. And every year, Kentucky gets those 3 cupcakes, along with Louisville, to add to that SEC schedule. And to win 6 or 7 games, all Kentucky has to do is go 3-6 in the non-cupcake games to qualify for that bowl game. So when you think Kentucky has turned the corner over the last couple of seasons, well, this season has changed a lot of people's mind. Why? The schedule is much more difficult. When you replace Austin Peay and Toledo with Alabama and Ole Miss, what do you expect? And yes, you can blame a lot of other extenuating circumstances. Chris Oates, the passing of John Schlarman, of course the COVID. They've been at this for 6 months now. Everybody in the SEC has been at this for 6 months now. They're all worn out. And having Florida and Alabama as 2 of the last 3 games on your schedule, and both of them on the road, that was impossible to overcome. But in this season, things aren't always as they appear. Is the blame on our favorite guy, Terry Wilson? And we have seen the last of Terry Wilson? Have we seen the last of Terry Wilson? Who knows? But with 1 game left this season and a potential bowl game, I don't know who and how people are qualifying for bowls this year. Who knows? What's the gain by playing him the rest of the way? He's a senior. And the buzz is he isn't going to stick around next year anyway, regardless of what happens the rest of the way, although he'll still have a year of eligibility due to the NCAA granting everyone another season due to the COVID circumstances. So if you're Kentucky, why do you play Wilson the rest of the year? If you want to win this year, if you want to win against South Carolina in your bowl game, yeah, go ahead and play him. He's your best option. But if you want to make sure you have an experienced quarterback going into next year, you might want to play Joey Gatewood and or Bo Allen. Look at it like this. What do you have to lose? The season finale against South Carolina, they've gotten a roll of stamps and mailed it in weeks ago. If you lose that game and the season is truly a 3-7 disaster, what's the difference between that and being 4-6 and heading into a bowl game? Who knows? So who do you play? Here's what I know. Terry Wilson was not totally to blame for yesterday's loss. His quarterback rating was 70.7 out of 100. And now he ranks 9th in the SEC in quarterback rating for the season. Why do we sound so surprised? Because he's finished 13th each of the last 2 years, including the big dream season of 2018. He's also, Terry Wilson is, ahead of Kellen Mond on the quarterback rating charts, who the almighty Phil Steele said was the SEC Player of the Year in the preseason. So it's the same question as with Eddie Gran. Will he be here next year? Should he be here next year? The fans probably don't want it. And it's tough to ignore the last 2 years with him. Gatewood and Allen are the future, and the future is now. Is the blame on the wide receivers? We've gone over ad nauseum on this show how poorly these guys have played and how they rate in the Pro Football Focus player grades, worse than the SEC. But help is on the way, right? And we talked about those magical, mythical high school kids who are taking high school classes on their computers right now and have already committed to Kentucky. Well, it's no longer 4, it's 3. So do you want those magical 3 recruits coming into town next year? And with the way the passing game has looked this season, do you think those 3 kids are still going to be in Kentucky next summer? I wouldn't bet on it. So don't expect the season to be a complete makeover at the position next year either, because it won't be. So who is to blame for this 3-6 season? Is it Stoops? Is it Eddie Gran? Is it Terry Wilson? Is it the wide receivers that Pro Football Focus has rated as the worst collection in the SEC and among the worst in all of college football? Is it the COVID virus making the SEC play 10 conference games and no cupcakes, exposing some teams like Kentucky as a fraud? Well, we think it's a combination of all these things. We said before the season this team had no chance in 4 of their 10 games and wondered how the Big Blue Nation could sit there and say that they'd run the table in the other 6. The fall guy for this season is probably going to be Eddie Grant. But there are a lot of people and a lot of events to blame for what's become a season to forget for Kentucky football. And that's the bottom line. ESPN Radio 1392.5. The bottom line with Brad Taylor. Elsewhere in college football, the college football playoffs came out this week. Here's a shocker for you. BYU and Cincinnati, both undefeated. They didn't get ranked in the top 6. I can't believe it. We've only been preaching that forever. Even the Central Floridas of the world can tell you, don't get your hopes up, even if you do go undefeated. So BYU and Cincinnati, enjoy your undefeated season, but enjoy your little Power 6 bowl, Field of 5 bowl, whatever it's called, that gives the underdeveloped conferences, non-Power 5s, a shot at a not decent bowl game at the end. But, of course, yesterday, number 1 Alabama defeated Auburn as a 24.5-point favorite, although Auburn kept trying for that backdoor cover at the end. We were hoping for that one. That's neither here nor there. And number 3, Clemson, finally playing for the first time in a month, routed Pittsburgh 52-17. Both of those teams, Alabama and Clemson, covered. And but there were 5 games yesterday among top 25 teams that were postponed or canceled. Michigan State burst the balloon of number 8 Northwestern. They were 13.5-point home underdogs, and they still won that game. That should tell you about Northwestern for you. They can never stand, no matter what sport it is, as soon as you think Northwestern's good at something, they always teach you never to trust Northwestern in any sport. Number 5, Texas A&M, squeaked by LSU 20-7. Aggies did not cover as LSU got the late backdoor touchdown, something we always like, the backdoor touchdown. Number 9, Georgia, who finally found a quarterback, covered in a rout of South Carolina, who we'll see at Lexington next week, but they didn't look like they tried very hard last night. They lost 45-16. And, of course, don't forget, coming up this week in college football, there's a Tuesday morning 10:30 game. Western Kentucky is right now, tentatively, scheduled to play Charlotte Tuesday morning at 10:30. Nothing says Tuesday morning like Western Kentucky and Charlotte going at it in college football. Charlotte, a 2-point favorite in this game. Hey, we'll take Western Kentucky. We've got 2 evenly matched teams. They're playing on a Tuesday morning. Anything can happen. And then we've got a trend for it, so we'll make it a Mac Daddy Stogie. Road teams against a home team on a losing streak. The road team covers 54.1% of the time. That's road dogs. If a road dog is playing a home team on a losing streak, 54.1% of the time, 904 wins, 767 losses. Huge sample size. Give us Western in that one. Tuesday morning, Mac Daddy Stogie. Get ready to fire them up. Turn off your Days of Our Lives at your General Hospital. Do people watch the soaps anymore? Even my mom doesn't watch the soaps anymore. We'd rather sit around and watch Maury Povich DNA tests and lie detector tests. So who cares about the soaps? There's your early Mac Daddy Stogie. Take Western on Tuesday morning. Elsewhere in college football next week, number 5, Texas A&M will go to, for now, number 22, Auburn. A&M probably should win that game, but don't be surprised if Auburn keeps it close. Matchup of top 25 teams. Number 12, Indiana, at number 16, Wisconsin. Why is Wisconsin even playing anymore? They're ineligible for the Big Ten championship. Why even bother? It's like Ohio State. How are you going to put Ohio State in the college football playoff if they only play 5 games? Who cares? In the SEC next week, Alabama finally travels to LSU. Any other year this century, that would have been a great game. Next week, not so much. It's going to be a sad day in Knoxville next week. Jarrett Guantano's final home game as the Volunteer fans kiss goodbye, and with great delight, I might add. The Jarrett Guantano in his final home game. Florida travels to Tennessee. Name the score for the Gators in that one. And the Bug Zapper games. Vandy goes to Georgia. Arkansas goes to Missouri. Big fun in the SEC. When you look at these schedules, it looks like these games are terrible, but then you watch the games on Saturday, hey, it was an interesting day in college football. But that's neither here nor there. Coming up after the break, today's a college basketball day, and college basketball started this week. In the next 60 hours, Kentucky has two big games that we'll try to tell you how to handicap coming up. But first, Whitetail Heavens, elite outdoor superstore. Do you have a hunter or a fisherman in your family? Do you know a hunter or a fisherman? If so, make sure to head down to Whitetail Heavens, elite outdoor superstore's grand opening continuing this weekend. I've been in that building myself, and it's an incredible facility. 29,000 square feet devoted to hunters and fishermen like you've never seen before. Equipment, apparel, archery skills you can practice. Your elite outdoor superstore has everything that your outdoors woman or man could need. So make sure to hit Whitetail Heavens Elite Outdoor Superstore. Their big grand opening this weekend, still happening 3 miles south of Fayette Mall. That's the Elite Outdoor Superstore, 3 miles south of Fayette Mall. College basketball coming up after the break right here on ESPN Radio 1300 and 92.5. ESPN Radio 1300, 92.5 FM. My picks are not as cold as ice, ladies and gentlemen, just for the record. Make sure to tune into our Mac Daddy Stogies later on in the show. It's The Bottom Line with Brad Taylor. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday morning. Hey, in case you missed it, college basketball season started on Wednesday. And on Wednesday night, of course, you all know Kentucky defeated Morehead 81-45, a game that didn't prove a whole lot based on the fact that Kentucky was a 25-point favorite going into the game. But, of course, after the game, many people raving about the Kentucky defense, comparing it to 2015 when they went 38-1. Let's not get carried away, ladies and gentlemen. But it was a big improvement over last year's team that ranked 88th in the country in defensive efficiency, according to the Ken Pom ratings, who we refer to quite a bit on this show. And it's it's far better than Kentucky's worst defensive team, which was the 2013 NIT team that I don't think they even refer to that. It's kind of like Rocky V. They don't refer to that team anymore. It's not even in the annals of history. They don't even have that anymore. Another take from Kentucky's win over Morehead. We don't even know who the best player on the team is yet. B.J. Boston, who all the pundits said was supposed to be the best player of the team, well, he led the team with 15 points, but the numbers tell us that Cameron Fletcher was the best player on the floor for Game 1, and he did it in half the time that B.J. Boston did. If you prorate Cameron Fletcher's numbers to the minutes that B.J. Boston got, he would have had 18 points and 10 rebounds. Just saying. But what I saw was it's going to be a while before we know who the best players are, and the cream will rise to the top and all those other cliches. But our aforementioned Lord and Savior of college basketball, Ken Pomeroy, didn't feel very good about Kentucky's win over Morehead. Kentucky was 11th in his ratings 2 weeks ago, somehow dropped to 12th before Wednesday's game, now back up to 11th. Of course, the real culprit for that was Virginia losing this week in an upset loss and taking a fall. So there you go. Now we look to today's game, Kentucky against Richmond. Today at 1 o'clock, Richmond will take the floor across the street here at Rupp Arena. And Richmond ranked number 62 in the current Ken Pom ratings as of this morning. And although they are not ranked by the AP voters, the prestigious Blue Ribbon College Basketball Yearbook, which I have been looking at for decades now, they had Richmond ranked number 22 in their preseason book. Out in the desert, Kentucky opened as a 7.5-point favorite. As of this morning, that line's down to 7. So let's look at why Richmond is getting some respect with the wise guys out in the desert on this one. Even though Friday night, Richmond defeated Morehead by 18, which was exactly half of what Kentucky defeated Morehead was by 2 nights before. But Richmond isn't your typical cupcake team. This is the preseason media pick to win the A-10. They returned all 5 starters from a team, and all 94.3% of their minutes played last year off a team that won 24 games and finished 46th in the final Ken Pom ratings, although they lost one of their starters from last year before the season started. This year, this team can shoot very well. They were in the top 50 last year, 2-point, 3-point, and free throw shooting percentage, so they can shoot. And they were 8th in the country in assist-to-turnover ratio, led by the Atlantic 10 Defensive Player of the Year, Jacob Gilliard, who led the nation in steals last year. But the desert shows respect for this team. This team is only 40-1 to win the national championship, 20-1 to make the Final Four. That's no bargain. And in Vegas last year, Richmond went 24-7 straight up, but 18-13 against the spread. That's very good. They gave you a profit. But their strengths aren't what you'll see today. On the road last season, Richmond went 9-3 straight up, but 6-6 against the spread. And in non-conference games last year, They were 10-3 straight up, 6-7 against the spread. Richmond's coach, Chris Mooney, is in his 16th season at Richmond. Seems like a long time for a coach at a non-Power 5 school without moving up. But he's won 55% of his games there in 16 years. That's fine and dandy. But you're not listening to hear that stuff. How's he done out in the desert? In the regular season, over those 16 years, against the point spread, all the games he's coached, Chris Mooney is 50.5% winner. On the road in those 16 years, 52.2%. Early in the season, in November, 47.5% is not good. Versus Power 5 teams, not good again, 46.5%. And in all non-conference games, Chris Mooney at Richmond hits to cover this point spread 44.1% of the time. So in every scenario that fits today's game, road, November, Power 5, non-conference, none of those scenarios has Chris Mooney broken the magical, mythical 52.38% break-even watershed mark out in the desert. So history tells us backing Richmond and Mooney today isn't exactly something you could say has a statistical edge unless you invest against John Calipari. And we've gone over this the last couple weeks. Since 2005, all teams ranked in the top 15 make you a lot of money in November. Blindly taking teams ranked in the top 15 in the month of November against unranked teams covers 55.9% of the time. 481 up, 371 down. That's a 860 game sample size of data. So yeah, taking Kentucky Dame has historical data backing it up, but not so fast. That trend works with guys like Coach K, Mark Few, Bill Self, Jay Wright, before yesterday. All those coach make a killing off these cupcake games in November, but Calipari does not. In the month of November, Calipari 27-30 against the spread when he's ranked in the top 15 facing an unranked team. And that number gets a lot worse when you add in a few filters like we do. In the first 5 games of the season at Kentucky, John Calipari is a home favorite against non-Power 5s, 13-22. That's 37%. And that includes his win Wednesday night over Moorhead. So neither team has a history of cashing tickets on a consistent basis in the situation you'll see today. Ken Palm says Kentucky 76-68. If you look at Kentucky today as a 7-point favorite, if you took them, I wouldn't say that was a bad deal. Richmond getting a lot of respect in the desert for this one. And Kentucky's history of failing to cover point spreads in this spot isn't something the wise guys have forgotten either. But, of course, I like to go back to my friend Lem Banker. Who's Lem Banker? He is 93 years old, and he is considered one of the greatest sports gamblers of all time. And he was living out in Vegas, and he was crunching numbers and grinding out winners on a daily basis almost up until the day he died. But he used to have a saying that he used all the time. They play the national anthem every day. And that was his way of saying, you don't have to have action on every single game. They'll play more games tomorrow. And speaking of games they'll play tomorrow, on Tuesday night, Kentucky will face Kansas in a blue blood matchup. In a game we discussed all last week on this show, Kansas played number 1 Gonzaga on Thanksgiving Day and got thumped 102-90 in a game where Kansas looked like they had no chance of ever stopping Gonzaga defensively. Now, was it that Gonzaga being so good? And they are. Or is it Kentucky simply not being, or Kansas not being that good? Well, we'll get a better feel for that answer when Kansas faces Kentucky on Tuesday night in Indianapolis. But let's look at the history of John Calipari versus Bill Self. Who gets the better of it between these two coaches? Well, it's John Calipari. In his time at Kentucky, Calipari has faced Self at Kansas 7 times. Calipari's 4-3 in those games straight up, including, the one everybody remembers, the 2012 National Championship game. Not only that, but Calipari is 5-2 against the point spread versus Bill Self while he's been at Kentucky. So no matter how you measure it, Calipari has gotten the better of Self here in Lexington. But that's too good to be true, isn't it? There's always a catch. There's always something in the background that's kind of making you wonder. And that catch is 2008. In case you don't remember, Calipari was at Memphis at the time. And Kansas and Memphis played for the national championship. And, of course, you remember that game. Memphis has a 9-point lead with 2 minutes to go. Somehow Memphis loses that game. Calipari blames misses free throws on the loss. Some of us may be blaming whether he should have fouled with less than 5 seconds on the clock when they were up 3, allowing Kansas to shoot the game-tying three-pointer. I digress. The last time these two coaches met, Self and Calipari, January of 2019, Kentucky won by 7 as a 5.5-point favorite. This game will be held at a neutral site in Indianapolis, but this is the age of COVID-19. Home advantage is not what it used to be, so location doesn't matter nearly as much these days. Of all the coaches in America, Bill Self fails to live up to expectations in the tournament as much as anyone, right up there with Coach K and Calipari. And we all know we'll go over that in March when it's relevant. But for now, during the regular season, what does Self do out in the desert? How does Bill Self fare against the spread? Very well when you compare him to Calipari. Regular season, he hits 54.2%. In December games, which is when this will be, Bill Self, 51.8%. In non-conference games, Bill Self against the spread, 54.7%. And in neutral site games, 51.7%. So in every one of those scenarios, Bill Self wins more than he loses. By the way, all 4 of those scenarios I just mentioned, they're all better than John Calipari's numbers in those scenarios. So Tuesday night, although Bill Self has historically not gotten the best of Calipari while he's been at Kentucky, despite that fact, the numbers say Kansas is going to be the play here. Depending on the results of today's game between Kentucky and Richmond, Ken Pom says Kansas will win this game by a point, 73-72. That's his projection. And if you're tired of Ken Pom references, I can give you an even worse reference. How about the ESPN BPI? They have Kansas ranked number 8, Kentucky ranked number 49. That's 49, Big Blue Nation. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just trying to tell you the truth. Now, the ESPN BPI, they factor in returning minutes, experience, things like that, which makes Kentucky look a lot weaker. Hey, the ESPN BPI has Richmond ranked number 27 over Kentucky's 49. I tend to agree. Kansas is the play Tuesday night, especially if they're getting points. Now, I don't know what the betting line will be for that game. I assume it'll be a one-possession game either way. But getting points in this spot, if Kansas is an underdog, I think I'd be running to the window with a fistful of dollars. But what we see in the next 60 hours will determine a lot about how good Kentucky is this season, more than anything we've seen in the preseason practices or the scrimmage against Moorhead. And that's the bottom line. ESPN Radio 1392.5. The bottom line with Brad Taylor. Other college basketball really quick. There were a few upsets this week. Last night, number 3 Villanova lost to Virginia Tech as a 9.5-point favorite. But that was nothing compared to number 4 Virginia losing on Friday to San Francisco as a 15.5-point favorite. Of course, Virginia throws in a dud like this all the time. Who could forget the 1 versus 16 matchup in the tournament when they were a 20-point favorite against UMBC? They lost that game. The ironic thing about these two losses, Villanova and Virginia, is that both those two coaches, Jay Wright, Tony Bennett, they are the best coaches in America against the point spread in all of college basketball during the regular season in the last 15 years. Tony Bennett hits 56.8% of the time. Jay Wright, 55.4%. So if you've been investing in these two coaches in the regular season over the years, you've done very well. You're probably not listening to the show because you're out on your yacht in the middle of the ocean. Dana Altman, of course, is 3rd of Oregon, but I digress. So, yeah, going against Villanova, Virginia, probably not the way to make you a lot of money in this world. But I would, we're not counting about March. Tony Bennett has had his problems despite his national championship at Marks. But those two coaches never go against Jay Wright and Tony Bennett regular season. Just saying. Other college basketball last night, Duke beat Coppin State only by 10 as a 39.5-point favorite. That was a rocking chair win. And Michigan State barely covered against Notre Dame as a 9.5-point favorite. They won by 10. This week in college basketball, good game today, Texas Tech at Houston. Texas Tech minus 2.5. I think I'd like to play the favorite in that one, Texas Tech. The numbers are on our side, and so are the trends. Before Kentucky and Kansas Tuesday night, Duke and Michigan State will play at Indianapolis. Duke will likely be favored in this one, but don't sleep on taking the Spartans if you're getting more than a possession. The desert, you know what I mean? If you know what I mean. Number 2, Baylor. They have a huge week this week. They play Wednesday night. They play Illinois, ranked number 8. A lot of wise guys like Illinois this week to make a run to the Final Four, but we aren't believers in them just yet. We think Baylor will win by this one by more than a possession. And next Saturday, the game of the year, number 1 Gonzaga against number 2 Baylor. Gonzaga is the best team in America right now, and they should take down Baylor, but I wouldn't want to lay too many points with Gonzaga in this one. Baylor getting more than a possession? Oh, I would take Baylor against Gonzaga. That's the week to come in college basketball. ESPN Radio 1392.5. Coming up after the break, of course, the most profitable segment in Lexington Radio, our Mac Daddy Stogie picks. But first, we're getting into the winter months now. Christmas is just around the corner. You need to get your car serviced and ready for all those trips to go see Santa Claus. Go see my good friends at Clark's Auto Service. They serviced my car a couple weeks ago. Runs like a dream, as it always has. Clark's Auto Service. Make sure to check them out. Bill Clark, Ethan Hall, and the staff out there, as good as it gets. ClarksAutoLexington.com. Coming up after the break, we're going to cash some tickets, as only we do, here on ESPN Radio 1392.5. ESPN Radio 1392.5. Bottom line with Brad Taylor. Let's get right to it. It's time for the most profitable segment in Lexington Radio, our Mac Daddy Stogie picks. Why do you call them the Mac Daddy Stogies? Because you can light up those victory cigars well before the game ends. Picking winners in the NFL is difficult, man. Ask any of the professionals out in the desert. They'll tell you that the NFL is tough to make a living off the NFL. And today's one of those days with COVID everywhere. And you can look at the Denver situation and look at how the COVID is killing the league right now. And Thanksgiving game's already gone. We find it difficult to make some picks today, but we're going to do quality over quantity today, so let's get to it. In the league where they play for pay, the New York Giants, 6-point favorites over the Bengals, a game you can hear on Classic Rock 92.1, our sister station, at 1 o'clock. Daniel Jones starts for the Giants. He's 14th in the Pro Football Focus ratings. Brandon Allen, off the practice squad, now starts for the Bengals. They thought Ryan Finley was going to start. Well, he's been stinking so bad last year and this year. Let's just give up on him. Let's put the practice squad guy out there. So, yes, Joe Burrow, may his season rest in peace. Sadly hurt last week, in case you missed it. Yeah, next year, he'll be back, hopefully. But for this year, you're going to suffer the rest of the way if you're the Bengals. Yeah, this is a team. They have putrid records, and no one is on the rise and in contention for a division title with these two guys. But the Bengals have been covering point spreads this year, and we'll give them credit for that. Now, how are they going to cover point spreads without Joe Burrow and Brandon Allen in? That's another story altogether. The under in this game, sitting at 42.5 at the moment. Anything can happen. This is not a game. The weather's not going to be an issue. This is not a game we want to look at the total, but we will take a pizza money prop in this game. Giovanni Bernard, if he plays, he's been a little injured. He's been on the injury list. But if he does dress and play this week, he's listed at 22.5 yards to go over in terms of rushing yards. If he's healthy, he'll go over this. Joe Mixon is out. The Bengals have to turn to some kind of running game with Brandon Allen as their new quarterback. And the Giants have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to running backs all year. So your pizza money prop for the Bengals game today on 92.1 Classic Rock at 1 o'clock. Gio Bernard over 22.5 rushing yards. But our other game that we're going to put our Mac Daddy Stogie on this today, the 49ers and the Rams out in Los Angeles. Nick Mullins, now your starter for the 49ers. He's 37th out of the 39 quarterbacks in the Pro Football Focus player ratings. Jared Goff, 19th. NFC West rivalry. Immediately we look to a defensive game. Teams that know each other, know how to stop each other. We're going to look at the under in this game. When our trend is divisional unders late in the season, and it's one of our favorite trends, very simple, since 2003 in divisional matchups in the month of November and December. And the total is 57 and below. That's a very high total. And this one is far below that one at 45. The under hits 58.7% of the time, 229 wins, 161 losses. That's a nice percent with a big sample size. Give us under 45 Rams and Niners today in L.A. So to recap, your pizza money prop over Gio Bernard if he dresses and plays, over 22.5 yards rushing, and go under. We always root for human disappointment, and that's what you do when you root for unders. Go under 45 in San Francisco and the Rams. Those are your Mac Daddy Stogies of the week. Coming up after the break, we'll preview the day on ESPN Radio, and it's a big one, I can promise you. That's coming up after the break, but first, BestLexingtonHomes.com. Right now, you may not think it's a great time to invest in real estate. All contrary, move frere. My good friend Trey McCauley says it's as good a time as ever, especially because there's not many houses up, so houses are in demand, the few that are up for sale. Contact my good friend Trey McConnelly. Look him up, bestlexingtonhomes.com. He's the best in the business at real estate. I can promise you that. Coming up after the break, we'll wrap it up and get ready for the rest of the day on ESPN Radio, here on ESPN Radio 1300 and 92.5. ESPN Radio 1300, 92.5. The Bottom Line with Brad Taylor. We thank you so much for joining us here on this Sunday morning. Thank you for listening to us. Coming up next on ESPN Radio, it'll be the Angelo Show. I know Angelo's put in a lot of time in recent weeks with high school football, UK pre- and post-game football, basketball. He does it all here at 1300. And, of course, his Sunday morning show. He's the best in the business, so make sure to stay tuned for him at the top of the hour and his views on the sports world. It's a big day here on the ESPN family of networks on 92.1 Classic Rock, of course, at 1 o'clock. The Bengals and the Giants, live from Cincinnati. At noon here on ESPN Radio, it'll be Tennessee and Indianapolis. And at 4 o'clock, New Orleans travels to Denver in a game that's as mysterious as anything ever because all the quarterbacks have been ruled out for the Broncos today. So we don't know who's going to play quarterback full-time. That line went from New Orleans as a 6-point favorite. Now, as of this morning, they were a 15-point favorite. Probably will go up. I would be looking to take the Broncos in the points, but that's neither here nor there. I wouldn't hate to go with Denver in that one. Tonight on ESPN Radio, it'll be the Bears and the Packers. MVP Mitch Trubisky back for the Bears, so that means literally anything can happen in either direction on that one. As always, we thank you for listening to The Bottom Line with Brad Taylor. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback, as always. We appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at BottomLineLex, and you can email the show anytime, bottomlinelex@gmail.com. Once again, we thank you so much for listening, and until the next time, as always, may the winners be yours.